Violence has emerged to be a common occurrence in today's sports scene. It can be attributed to several factors like the increasing incidence of violence in sporting activities and increasing media attention when there is the occurrence of violent acts or a combination of both. The prevalence of violence in sports is currently higher today than compared to previous years. It is important to establish whether violence and aggression related to sports are ethical or not. Moral reasoning on a case-by-case basis can be applied with the aim of determining whether or not particular acts of sports-related violence are ethical. Defining the role of various sports stakeholders, such as coaches, fans, administrators, and players, in combating violence and aggressive behavior in sports can lead to a significant reduction in acts of violence. The escalation of violence in sports should be addressed since reducing sports violence is likely to lead to the reduction of violence in general society. This paper aims at examining sports-related violence, the factors that influence the violence, and ways in which sports participants and spectators can apply moral reasoning to incidents of sports violence. This study aims at addressing the escalating cases of violence in sports by focusing on the following objectives: evaluate the prevalence of violent acts in professional sports, application of moral models of reasoning in addressing the acts of violence in sports, examining factors that contribute to the occurrence of violence in sports, and strategies that can be adopted with the aim of reducing violence in professional sports. Sports violence refers to the behavior that causes harm, occurs outside of the sporting rules, and is unrelated to the competitive objective of sports. It can also be referred to as the use of excessive physical force that is capable of causing potential harm or destruction. Violent acts inherently form part of many sports. In various sports such as football, tackling and blocking are often conducted in a violent manner with the aim of intimidating or sending a message to the player in possession of the ball. Hockey is often characterized by a violent aspect where there is physical contact during body checking, where a player knocks the opponent using the shoulder or hip against the ice. Extreme violence in the game of hockey occurs when players engage in the actual fight whose purpose and intention is acceptable in the game. There are elements of violence in the game of rugby mainly due to its nature. Boxing is a violent game where opponents punch one another with the aim of earning points to achieve victory by causing as much physical harm as possible to their opponents. Few sports are more violent than ultimate fighting, which was forced off television and eventually banned by most states because of its brutality. Ultimate fighting was brought back in 2001 largely because of the sports rules change that were supposed to soften punching, stomping, kneeing, and elbowing that are so prevalent in the sport. Violence in sports continues to persist since the society supports acts of violence in sporting events. It is considered to be the nature of sports. Most spectators find acts of violence to be highly entertaining. When a violent act erupts in the game of football, fans give a big applause and cheer. In the game of boxing, fans feel the value of their money when one opponent beats the other opponent to the point of submission. There is a perverted sense of enjoyment portrayed by fans when a player or a fan from the opposing side is injured during a violent act. Despite the fact that society enjoys these violent sports, the fact that violent sports contribute to the escalation of violence in society cannot be disputed. Organizers need to remove violence from sports. If a reduction of violence in sports can contribute to the larger goal of decreasing violence in society, organizers should examine ways to make the sport less violent. It can be argued that sports serve the purpose of allowing a violent person to behave violently in a controlled sports setting. Sports that include physical contact might serve as an outlet in which some participants can release their violent tendencies. If sports is capable of serving as a catharsis for violent persons, it may contribute to the reduction in violence in the society to a certain extent. There is currently no valid evidence to confirm the claim, although it can hypothetically be argued that individuals who are more violent might find some relief through participation in more aggressive events like sports. Society is to blame for the reinforcement of violence through various ways such as attending violent sports and participating in violent behaviors during these events. Violence is expected and accepted in many sports, whether it's for better or for worse. The media networks also bear the blame for promoting violence in sports by broadcasting violent sporting events. Governing bodies for these sporting events could be blamed for not changing the violent nature of the games while they have the jurisdiction to make necessary changes, including the competitors who actually play these games. Athlete aggression is directly and strongly related to the team's morale atmosphere. The norms of a team form an important aspect of a moral atmosphere. When coaches and teammates entertain and support violent behavior, there is a possibility of such acts being repeated. Team cultures can influence athletes to engage in violence outside of the sport. The common targets of violence outside sports include women and others in the community who publicly challenge the assumed status and privilege of the athlete. Viable strategies need to be developed with the aim of breaking the cycle of violence in sports. Coaches should avoid teaching violent strategies. Rules and sanctions need to be enforced by administrators to minimize in-game violence. By emphasizing fundamental moral values, sports people might begin to break the cycle of violence that haunts sports on so many levels. Although the legislation and enforcement of rules against fighting may fail to realize genuine respect among sports participants, it reinforces the notion that fighting is considered inappropriate by governing bodies and officials. Game officials and referees should be instrumental in discouraging the teaching of violent strategies and practices through the enforcement of rules. The modern sports is characterized by various forms of spectator violence. There are numerous cases where fans abuse and fight one another. Fans have also been known to attack coaches when team loses or fails to win. Sports officials are targets of abuse from spectators and participants alike. Some highly violent fans often drink and urinate in the streets, assault one another, and commit acts of vandalism, including overturning cars and setting them on fire. At times, the enforcement agencies find it difficult to restore order during fan-fueled violence. The essence of sports can be disrupted by altercations that take place between players and spectators. Some fans precipitate altercations when they overstep their boundaries and engage morally unacceptable acts, such as threatening players, hurling insults, or jumping over the fences to attack players. When a player retaliates, then he or she is not practicing the moral values of respect and honor. Players who are less self-restrained can sometimes let their emotions get the best of them and engage in retaliatory attacks. The research study will be addressed using a mixed methodology involving both qualitative and quantitative design. The qualitative approach involves systematic and descriptive analysis of historical cases of sports violence by illuminating the factors that contributed to the violence, the reactions, and whether legal actions were taken to address the issues. The quantitative approach will involve collecting factual data from various stakeholders in sports using instruments like surveys and interviews. Open-ended questionnaires will be designed to capture data. Purposive sampling strategy will be used to determine the appropriate individuals that will form part of the study sample. The study to collect from approximately 250 participants who must be of legal age and can consent to be part of the study. A statistical and analytical tool will be used to establish the statistical significance of the data collected. The numerous cases of violence that occur in-game and outside the sporting arenas should be an issue of great concern to anyone wishing to reduce the unnecessary violence in sports. It is important for all stakeholders in sports, such as fans, players, athletes, administrators, and coaches, to come together with the aim of acknowledging the violence surrounding sports and collaborate to reduce or eliminate it. Everyone involved in sports has the moral responsibility of creating a safe environment for the enjoyment of participants and spectators alike. Proactive steps to safeguard sports and preserve its integrity can be taken by understanding the factors that contribute to the unnecessary violence.